Welcome to the Explainer. Imagine, just for a second, that you've been handed the keys to the most complex, powerful machine on Earth. You are a newly minted operator stepping into the futuristic macroeconomic command center of the U.S. economy. Before you is this massive console just covered in levers, dials, and flashing screens, all designed to keep the entire economy moving smoothly. So let's dive into this. We're going to figure out what these levers actually do and see if we can keep this massive system from spinning out of control together.
Taking a quick look at our system diagnostic menu, we're covering the aggregate demand dashboard, liquidity preference theory, the monetary policy lever, hitting the zero bound, the fiscal policy thrusters, and finally, multipliers and crowding out.
All right, Section 1, the aggregate demand dashboard. This is how we read the economy's pulse.
So aggregate demand, which is just the total quantity of goods and services demanded across the entire economy at a given price level, always slopes downward. But why is that? Well, it's actually driven by three sequential domino effects that kick in when the overall price level drops. First up, you have the wealth effect. When prices fall, the dollars in your pocket suddenly become more valuable. You literally feel wealthier, and because of that, you naturally spend more. Second, there's the interest rate effect. Lower prices mean people don't need to hold on to as much cash, so they deposit it in the bank, which drives down interest rates. Cheaper borrowing means companies go out and build new factories or buy equipment. And finally, the exchange rate effect. Lower U.S. interest rates cause the dollar to depreciate against foreign currencies. That means our domestic goods become cheaper for people in other countries, which is a massive boost to our net exports. So lower prices essentially light up all three of these sectors to boost overall demand.
Moving to Section 2, liquidity preference theory, the engine of interest rates.
It turns out, if we really want to understand our dashboard, we have to talk about John Maynard Keynes and his liquidity preference theory. Basically, his theory states that the interest rate adjusts to balance the supply of and demand for money in the short run. Think about it like this. In the short run, the prices of goods are kind of stuck, right? They don't just change overnight. So instead of prices instantly adjusting to balance things out, it's the interest rate, that fluid spinning dial on our console, that constantly moves up and down to keep the money market perfectly balanced.
Section 3, the monetary policy lever. This is the central bank console.
Let's execute an expansionary monetary injection and watch the chain reaction. It's fascinating. Step 1. The Federal Reserve buys government bonds in open market operations. Step 2. The dollars used to buy those bonds are instantly deposited into banks, increasing reserves and expanding the total money supply. Step 3. Because there's suddenly all this extra money flowing around, the equilibrium interest rate naturally drops. Step 4. Those cheaper borrowing costs strongly stimulate business investment. And finally, Step 5. Overall aggregate demand expands, shifting the entire economic curve to the right. It is a brilliant little sequence.
Check out how perfectly this mechanical linkage works in practice. When the Fed expands that money supply, it forces the equilibrium interest rate to drop down. And that action directly drives aggregate demand. Because borrowing is now cheaper across the board, spending increases, pushing the aggregate demand curve outward. It's a beautiful, direct cause and effect relationship between the money supply and national output.
Now for Section 4, hitting the zero bound, a system warning.
Suddenly, a flashing red light goes off on our console. System warning, the liquidity trap. This is literally a macroeconomic operator's worst nightmare. Remember, monetary policy relies on lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy. But what happens if the target interest rate has already fallen to zero? We actually saw this during the 2008 recession. This is known as the zero lower bound. Nominal interest rates can't really go below zero. I mean, if they did, you'd be paying the bank to hold your money. You'd rather just stuff physical cash under your mattress. So if rates hit zero, pumping more liquidity into the system just stops working entirely. People simply hold the extra cash, and our shiny monetary lever becomes completely jammed.
Which brings us to Section 5, the fiscal policy thrusters, the government console.
Since the monetary lever is jammed, we have to use the fiscal thrusters, specifically government purchases. But to really grasp their sheer power, we first need to understand a psychological metric called the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. This is simply the fraction of extra income that a household chooses to consume rather than save. Imagine you earn a brand new extra dollar today. If your MPC is 3/4, you're going to go out and spend exactly 75 cents of that dollar on, say, lunch, and you'll save the remaining 25 cents. That 75-cent spending habit, that is the secret fuel for our fiscal thrusters.
Because, you see, that 75 cents doesn't just vanish. It kicks off an economic chain reaction known as the multiplier effect feedback loop. Let's trace it out. Step 1. The government decides to buy $20 billion in new planes from Boeing. Step 2. Boeing uses that $20 billion to pay its workers and its owners. Step 3. Those workers go out and spend their new income based on their MPC. Let's say they spend 75% of it. Step 4. Local restaurants and businesses receive this spending as brand new revenue. And Step 5, this is the truly amazing part, those local business owners turn around and spend 75% of that revenue themselves. The cycle repeats endlessly, generating a massive amount of total demand from just one single government action.
You can really see the sheer power of this multiplier effect at work. That initial $20 billion government purchase shifts aggregate demand outward, but that's just the start. The multiplier effect kicks in, and those rolling, repeating waves of consumer spending push the aggregate demand even further. The government didn't have to spend all that extra money, everyday citizens did the heavy lifting for them through a positive feedback loop.
So, what's the mathematical punchline here? It's the number 4. Using an elegant little formula, 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, we can find our exact multiplier. If the MPC is 3/4, that formula gives us a multiplier of exactly 4. That means that initial $20 billion government contract we just tracked actually generates an astonishing $80 billion of total demand for goods and services. That is a hugely amplified thrust to our economic engines.
Section 6. Multipliers and crowding out. The opposite force.
But as we push those fiscal thrusters to the max, another warning light appears. System resistance, the crowding out effect. So here's the catch. An increase in government purchases definitely stimulates demand, but it also causes the interest rate to rise. Why? Because the government usually has to borrow massive amounts of money to pay for those planes, which increases the overall demand for money. That resulting higher interest rate directly reduces private investment spending. Essentially, significant government borrowing can crowd out private companies from borrowing money to build their own factories, and that pushes back against the multiplier, dampening the intended economic boost.
Moving on to the reality of time lags.
Let's step back and neutrally compare the real-world constraints of our two control systems here. The monetary console, operated by the central bank, is fast to activate but slow to actually take effect. Because firms and households make their spending plans far in advance, it takes about 6 months for a change in interest rates to noticeably alter aggregate demand. The fiscal console, on the other hand, takes years just to activate. It requires drafting proposals, navigating deeply divided congressional committees, and passing laws through both the House and the Senate. Because active stabilization policy is so plagued by these political and practical lags, many economists argue we should just rely on automatic stabilizers instead. These are things like the tax system and welfare benefits that automatically stimulate demand during a recession without needing any new congressional action whatsoever.
Which leaves us staring at our macroeconomic command center with one final, pretty unsettling question. If monetary policy gets completely trapped at the zero bound and active fiscal policy takes years to navigate political gridlock, who is truly steering the ship when the next crisis hits? Do we rely on the painfully slow hands of policymakers, or do we trust the autopilot of automatic stabilizers? Think about that the next time you hear our promise of a quick, painless fix to the economy. Thanks so much for joining me in the control room for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.